What if Michael Jackson's death was not an accident, not an excess, not a predictable tragedy, but the logical outcome of a system that never forgives those who step out of line? What you are about to hear was not created to entertain. It was created to disturb. For decades, the public only knew the character. The eccentric artist, the fragile genius, the icon surrounded by scandals. But far from the cameras, there was another Michael. A man who understood contracts better than many executives and knew exactly when he stopped being a person and became an asset. This story begins behind the scenes, in corridors without windows, rooms where cell phones were forbidden, and meetings that never appeared on official schedules. It is there that a former industry insider, someone who lived for years behind the stage, decided to break a silence that lasted decades. He was not an artist, nor a famous businessman. He was the kind of professional who solved problems without being seen. He coordinated tours, access, schedules, and sensitive decisions. His work demanded absolute discretion. That is precisely why he saw things that should never have been seen. It was in this environment that he came to know Michael Jackson as few ever did. Not the star, but the man, alert, suspicious, always watching who entered and who left the room. Michael asked questions that made executives uncomfortable, questions that were not supposed to be asked. The origin of the problem is not in the death, but in power. From a very young age, Michael learned that success comes at a cost. The greater the fame, the fewer real choices you have. The industry gives applause with one hand and restrains with the other, using contracts as invisible handcuffs. Over time, Michael began to resist. He questioned clauses, refused imposed medical decisions, demanded control over his own catalog. That was the moment the treatment changed. Trusted people were replaced. Phone calls were interrupted. The circle began to close. According to the insider, Michael said he felt something impossible to prove, but easy to recognize. Surveillance. It was not paranoia. It was a pattern. Whenever someone threatens the financial balance of the system responds. Silently, strategically, and irreversibly. In a short phone call, made late at night, Michael reportedly said something that never left this man's mind. When you understand how everything really works, you become a problem. That sentence was not a complaint. It was a conclusion. Michael knew he had crossed a point of no return. This documentary does not try to prove individual guilt. It reconstructs a path where an artist stops being human, becomes property, and when he tries to reclaim his voice, turns into a risk. From this point on, every detail matters, because some endings are written long before the final breath. After that first contact, the meeting stopped being casual. Michael began to observe who sat in meetings, who spoke for him, and who remained silent. He used to say that in the industry, silence is almost always more dangerous than a lie. In one of those conversations, he revealed something unsettling. Important decisions were being made without his authorization. Dates were changed, doctors hired, schedules redefined. Always in the name of well-being, but never with his direct consent. The former insider recalls a specific meeting, a closed room, reinforced security, cell phones sealed in envelopes. An executive stated without hesitation that Michael needed to trust the system more. That sentence did not sound like advice. It sounded like a warning. It was during this period that Michael began to talk about control. Not artistic control, but physical and mental control. He said he felt that others were deciding when he should sleep, wake up, appear, and disappear, as if his autonomy had an expiration date. Here an uncomfortable question emerges. When does someone stop owning their own body? When contracts begin to dictate rest, pain, and silence, does freedom still exist, or only the illusion of it? According to the account, Michael no longer trusted much of his own team. People close to him were replaced without explanation. Long-time professionals vanished overnight. There was always an official justification. There was never a real explanation. Fear did not appear as panic, but as extreme caution. Michael chose his words carefully, avoided certain topics in closed environments, and repeated something disturbing. They listen more than they speak. To him, nothing there was coincidence. The former insider realized that this was not the behavior of an unstable man, but of someone cornered, a man surrounded by contracts, financial interests, and impossible expectations, trying to survive inside a structure that did not tolerate resistance. The industry tends to reward obedience and punish questioning. Artists who accept the rules prosper. Those who demand control become difficult, and the difficult ones start being treated as problems to be solved. Michael knew this. He understood that he had crossed the invisible line between being profitable and being dangerous. From that point on, every step he took was observed. Because when an asset starts thinking like a human being, the system reacts. It was during this period that Michael began to record everything mentally. He said writing things down was dangerous. He preferred to trust his memory as someone who knows that any physical trace could be used against him at the right moment. The former insider reports that on more than one occasion, Michael mentioned new people circulating around his home without clear explanation. Professionals introduced as temporary support, but who never left. Always watching, always silent. In one early morning call, after an exhausting rehearsal, Michael reportedly called just to confirm something simple. Do you still remember who really decides? The question sounded rhetorical, but carried a strange weight, as if he were testing boundaries. The industry usually operates this way. First it isolates, then it exhausts, and finally it replaces. When that does not work, it creates convenient narratives. Michael understood this process perfectly. He had seen others go through it before him. Here another essential dilemma emerges. When someone is surrounded by decisions they do not make, by people they do not choose, and by routines they do not control, can they still be held responsible for their own collapse? According to the account, Michael began refusing certain medications. He questioned dosages, effects, and reasons. This caused immediate discomfort. It was not common for an artist to challenge medical instructions within that system. Shortly after these refusals, the atmosphere shifted again. Conversations became mediated. Phone calls were shortened. Information arrived filtered. Michael described the sensation as being trapped inside his own schedule. The former insider states that at that point, it was no longer just about money or contracts. It was about total control. Because whoever controls the body controls the silence, and whoever controls the silence controls the narrative. Michael seemed aware of the risk. He did not speak about escape. He spoke about consequences. He said that when an asset becomes unpredictable, the system does not negotiate. It corrects. These were not scattered thoughts. They were conclusions drawn by someone who deeply understood how the industry works. And the more Michael tried to reclaim autonomy, the clearer it became that the outcome would not be decided by him. That was when Michael stopped speaking in metaphors. In a short, direct phone call, without hesitation, he said something that sounded not like fear, but certainty. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. The former insider recalls asking if he was safe. Michael replied coldly, "Safe people are the ones who obey." There was no dramatization, just a statement, like someone who had already accepted that certain choices have no clean exit. In the days that followed, Michael repeated the same sentence to different people in different contexts. "They want it to look like my fault." It was always said quietly, almost technically, as if describing a known procedure. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Artists who questioned contracts, creative control, or ownership rights also reported extreme exhaustion, isolation, and public breakdowns. The difference was that Michael was too big to simply disappear. There is a critical moment in every power structure when eliminating becomes cheaper than negotiating, not financially, but symbolically. Michael seemed to understand that he had reached that exact point. In another call, made late at night, he was even more specific. They will say it was excess, that I couldn't handle it, that protects everyone except the truth. The sentence did not sound like speculation, it sounded like a script. This is the question that runs through this entire story. Who benefits when the blame always falls on the individual and never on the system? When collapse becomes entertainment and context is conveniently erased? The former insider states that after this conversation, he felt something difficult to explain. It was not immediate fear. It was the sensation of having heard a farewell disguised as a warning. Shortly afterward, the news began to accumulate. Rehearsals intensified, routines were altered, pressure mounted for grand performances despite visible exhaustion. To the public, it was a triumphant return. Inside, it was a body being pushed beyond its limits. Michael no longer spoke about a distant future. He spoke about damage control, about leaving messages, about being remembered beyond the official narrative. As if he knew that when everything ended, the truth would need someone willing to reconstruct it. In the days leading up to his death, Michael almost completely vanished from normal interaction. Access was restricted. Long-time contacts could no longer reach him directly. Everything passed through carefully positioned intermediaries. The former insider reports that Michael described his own home as a strange place, no longer a refuge, but a controlled environment. Entries and exits were monitored, rigid schedules, excessive silence. Nothing felt casual. It was during this period that medical decisions began to be made without open discussion. Unconventional protocols were adopted. Powerful substances became part of the nightly routine, always justified as necessary for performance. Here another disturbing question arises. When rest becomes an obstacle and sleep must be chemically induced, the body stops being human and becomes a tool. A tool that cannot fail. Michael reportedly questioned these procedures more than once. He asked for alternatives, he asked for breaks, he asked for time. The responses were always technical, cold, accompanied by assurances that everything was under control. According to the account, he even said he was afraid to sleep, not afraid of nightmares, but afraid of not waking up. That sentence, spoken days earlier, was never officially recorded. The last phone call was brief. No direct accusations, no names, just a sentence that ended the conversation. If I disappear, you already know why. After that, the phone never rang again. That night, the world slept unaware that one of the most recognizable artists in history was alone, sedated, subjected to a procedure that should never occur outside a hospital environment. When the news broke, it was already prepared. Overdose, accident, excess, simple words, easy to understand and even easier to accept. The perfect narrative to shut down questions. But for those who heard the warnings, for those who watched the circle slowly close, that death was not a surprise. It was confirmation. The final act of a story written long before the last breath. Minutes after the death was confirmed, the invisible protocol was activated. Lawyers were contacted before close family members. Statements began to be drafted while the body was still inside the house. The scene was quickly isolated, not as a place of investigation, but as a space of containment. The objective did not seem to be understanding what happened, but controlling how it would be told. Early reports mentioned delayed resuscitation attempts. Others cited confusion over timelines. Each version added another layer of noise, making it impossible to reconstruct a clear sequence of events. One detail stood out to those familiar with medical protocols. The substance mentioned in preliminary reports was not used for ordinary insomnia. It was a surgical anesthetic, administered only in controlled environments. The question that was never satisfactorily answered is simple. Who authorized it? Who decided that such an extreme procedure was acceptable inside a private residence? The attending physician quickly became the focal point. A single name, a single face, a functional culprit. The narrative needed someone small enough to absorb blame without expanding the questions. Meanwhile, contracts began to be reviewed. Royalties, catalogs, insurance policies, and old agreements were reactivated. Death did not interrupt the business. It accelerated it. The former insider noticed something unsettling. The more the world mourned, the less shaken the industry seemed. There was too much efficiency, too much organization, as if this ending had already been anticipated. In the media, the tone was almost unanimous. Personal tragedy, excess, a genius who could not carry his own weight. Little was said about imposed decisions, isolation, or control. Responsibility was thus relocated with surgical precision, from the system to the individual, from the collective to the man alone. The machinery remained intact, clean, and silent. When the trial began, the script was already defined. It was not about uncovering the entire truth, but about offering the public an acceptable ending, a recognizable culprit, a human error, a period at the end. The doctor was presented as negligent, isolated, almost alone in his decisions. Little was said about who hired him, who paid him, who authorized his actions, and who directly benefited from every choice made. During the hearings, essential questions were carefully avoided. Why was a surgical anesthetic available inside a home? Why was there no proper monitoring? Why did the orders always come from above? Justice moved in a straight line, without dangerous detours. The verdict provided emotional closure for the public, but no discomfort for the system. It was exactly the balance that needed to be preserved. The former insider watched everything in silence. Each testimony seemed to confirm what Michael had predicted. The blame would be concentrated in a place small enough not to reach anyone bigger. When the sentence was announced, there was a sense of closure. Headlines spoke of accountability, of lessons learned. But no machinery was dismantled, no structure was questioned. Shortly afterward, the doctor left prison. Life moved on. Contracts remained in force. Michael's catalog generated billions. Death became even more profitable than life. This is another cruel paradox of the industry. Some artists only become fully controllable after they die. They no longer speak, resist, or question. They only generate revenue. While fans held vigils and preserved memories, executives celebrated numbers. The official narrative was consolidated. Questioning it began to sound inconvenient, almost disrespectful. But silence is never permanent. It merely waits for the right moment to be broken. And that is precisely why this story continues to be told, even against the will of those who would prefer it had ended there. Few people understand where real power in the music industry resides. It is not on stages or in awards. It is in the control of catalogs. Whoever controls the music controls the past, the present, and the future. Michael understood this better than anyone. Since the 1980s, he treated publishing rights as strategic territory. It was not vanity, it was survival. Every contract was analyzed like a battlefield. When Michael became the owner of historic catalogs, including works that were not only musical, but cultural, he crossed an invisible line. An artist was not supposed to hold that much power within a system designed to exploit him. Executives tolerate stars. They do not tolerate owners, especially owners who understand too much and refuse to sell. Michael rejected billion-dollar offers, not for money, but for control. According to internal accounts, Michael's catalog was seen as a mistake that needed correction, something temporary. An anomaly within a system that demands a clear hierarchy between those who create and those who command. After his death, what could not be taken during his lifetime was redistributed efficiently. Catalogues changed hands. The system's logic was restored, without resistance, without difficult negotiations. Here another question imposes itself. Did Michael die in debt, or was he kept in debt? Because debt forces decisions, and forced decisions create opportunities for those who wait patiently. Death did not terminate contracts, it activated them. Dormant clauses came into effect, insurance policies were triggered, rights were renegotiated, silence became officially profitable. For the public, all of this happened far from the spotlight. While emotional tributes filled television screens, cold meetings quietly redefined who would control the legacy of the most valuable artist of the century. In the end, Michael lost exactly what he tried to protect throughout his life, control over his own work, and that may explain why his story was never only about music, but about power. Michael was not the only one to perceive this mechanism. Other artists, in different moments, touched the same sensitive point. Prince, for example, spoke openly about contracts as modern forms of slavery. Shortly before his death, Prince stated that the industry preferred artists who were exhausted and dependent. He said that whoever controlled the catalogue controlled the artist's soul. Months later, he also died under circumstances surrounded by controversy. Years earlier, Tupac Shakur denounced pressure, surveillance, and persecution after attempting to expose the inner workings of power, media, and money. He too died young, officially just another closed case. These cases do not prove a single conspiracy. They reveal a pattern in which artists who challenge deep structures begin to be treated as risks rather than talents. The unavoidable question is this: how many warnings are necessary before they stop being coincidences? How many voices must be silenced before someone accepts that something is structurally wrong? The industry does not need to kill directly in order to destroy. Sometimes it is enough to pressure, isolate, medicalize, and discredit. When collapse comes, it appears spontaneous, but it rarely is. Michael understood this. That is why he spoke in messages, symbols, and public warnings. He knew that a direct accusation would be neutralized quickly. What he left behind were traces. Songs, speeches, strange pauses in interviews, phrases spoken out of context. All of this now seems less random and more calculated, as if he were trying to speak to those willing to listen. The former insider states that Michael did not believe he would be saved. He believed only that the truth might survive, that one day someone would connect the dots. This account exists for that reason, not to accuse specific names, but to expose a mechanism. Because systems rarely fall because of one man, but men often fall because of systems. As time passes, details fade, but patterns remain. The story of Michael Jackson is sustained not only by official facts, but by the gaps between them. And it is in those gaps that truth often hides. The public was taught to consume collapse as spectacle. Pain became headline material, death became product. Few asked who truly profited when the music stopped. There is something deeply disturbing about a system that turns human beings into assets and then blames those same human beings when they break under the imposed weight. Michael tried to warn us, not through direct accusations, but through signs. He knew that saying too much would mean immediate erasure, so he chose to say just enough for someone in the future to understand. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the death itself, but how easily it was accepted. Because accepting simple explanations is far more comfortable than confronting complex structures. The final question is not about Michael Jackson, it is about us. To what extent do we participate in this system when we applaud, consume, and forget without questioning? Every industry is sustained by the silence of many and the fall of a few. As long as that balance is preserved, stories like this will continue to repeat themselves under different names. Michael Jackson left behind music, images, and an undeniable cultural legacy. But perhaps his most important legacy was the warning almost no one wanted to hear. Truth rarely shouts. It whispers, waits, and resurfaces when someone chooses to pay attention. Stories like this survive not because they are comfortable, but because someone refuses to let them disappear. If this account made you question something, do not ignore it. Keep listening, keep investigating, keep remembering. Because as long as there are people willing to hear and pass these stories on, no system can completely erase what it tried to bury.